Did you know that in ancient Rome, there were rules for almost everything, even how you slept, bathed, and walked through the streets? Some were strict, some were strange, but all of them kept one of history's greatest empires running smoothly. Welcome back to the channel. Today we re-diving deep into the fascinating and often weird daily life rules of ancient Rome that help maintain order in a city of millions. If you love uncovering hidden histories and exploring the secrets of the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from our channel. In this video, we'll explore everything from bathhouse etiquette and marketplace laws to sleep schedules, religious rituals, and even how slaves and citizens navigated the crowded streets of Rome. By the end, you'll understand just how these rules some practical kept one of the world's most powerful empires running for centuries. Rome did not wake with a roar. It woke with repetition. Before the sun climbed above the tiled roofs, before the marble columns caught their first pale light, the city was already moving, not chaotically, not wildly, but according to habits so old that no one remembered who had first set them. Rome was not held together by walls alone, nor by legions marching at its borders. It was held together by daily rules, quiet expectations, and customs followed so faithfully that they became invisible. This was a city where life ran on routine, where millions of people, citizens, foreigners, slaves, merchants, soldiers shared the same narrow streets without constant collapse into disorder. They did so because every action, from waking to sleeping, from eating to mourning, followed patterns shaped by law, tradition, and fear of disruption. To live in Rome was to know your place in time, space, and society. As dawn approached, bakers rose first. Their work was regulated not by kindness, but by necessity. Bread shortages had caused riots before. The state knew this, so bakers were bound by rules that made their profession hereditary. A baker could not simply stop baking. His son would bake after him. His family belonged, in a sense, to the ovens of Rome. This was not cruelty, it was control, and control kept the city fed. Nearby, water flowed endlessly through aqueducts, feeding fountains that never slept. Even water followed rules. Certain fountains were public, others private. Drawing water improperly could lead to punishment. Water thieves existed in Rome, quietly redirecting pipes, but the law watched carefully. Water was life, and life was regulated. As light filled the streets, shutters opened. Shopkeepers displayed their goods in doorways, careful not to block the road too far. Streets were narrow, and movement mattered. Even before formal traffic laws, customs ruled the flow of people. To step out of line was to invite conflict or fines. Rome was loud, crowded, and dense, and yet it functioned. This was because Romans believed deeply that order was moral. A well-ordered life reflected a well-ordered soul. Chaos was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous, even sinful. The gods favored balance, proportion, and ritual. Daily life was therefore shaped to please not only the state, but the divine. Every Roman household followed a familiar rhythm. At its heart stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, whose authority was nearly absolute. His power extended over children, slaves, property, and ritual duties. But even he was bound by expectations. He was required to perform daily offerings to the household gods, the Lares. Forgetting these rituals was not a private mistake. It was believed to endanger the entire household. Thus, religion was not something practiced only in temples. It lived inside kitchens, bedrooms, courtyards. Small shrines glowed with oil lamps. Incense burned quietly. These acts were not dramatic. They were repetitive, and repetition was the foundation of Roman stability. Children learned rules before they learned freedom. They watched adults closely, how they spoke, when they sat, how they greeted others. Respect was physical. Standing when elders entered a room was not optional. Speaking out of turn was corrected early. Rome trained its citizens from childhood to accept structure. Outside the home, the city itself instructed its people. Public spaces carried invisible laws. Forums demanded appropriate clothing and behavior. Markets allowed bargaining, but not chaos. Bathhouses welcomed nearly everyone, yet followed strict routines of entry, movement, and conduct. Rome was generous with access, but strict with form. Even time itself belonged to the state. Romans did not divide hours equally as we do. Daylight hours changed length with the seasons, and citizens adjusted their lives accordingly. The sun dictated labor, rest, and prayer. Time was public knowledge, announced and shared. To ignore it was to stand apart from society. Underlying all of this was a quiet fear of disorder. Romans remembered civil wars, plagues, fires, and invasions. They believed these disasters came when tradition weakened. Some were written into law, others were passed through habit. Many were never questioned. Why must carts be restricted? Why must clothing follow rank? Why must mourning end at a certain time? Why must certain foods be eaten certain ways? Because Rome believed that small controls prevented large disasters. To an outsider, these rules might seem strange, even absurd. Why should a man be fined for wearing the wrong color? Why should a woman be judged for how she mourns? Why should noise, movement, or leisure be regulated? But to a Roman, these rules were not oppression. They were the reason the city still stood. Rome did not depend on constant force. Soldiers were visible at the edges of empire, not in every street. Inside the city, order came from shared expectations, from knowing what was allowed, from fearing social shame more than punishment. This is why Rome endured, not because every citizen loved the law, but because everyone understood it. In the chapters ahead, we will step slowly into these daily rules. We will walk through Roman mornings and evenings. We will sit at their tables, enter their baths, listen to their streets, and observe their private lives. And as we do, we will see that the Roman Empire was not held together only by conquest. It was held together by habit, by quiet obedience, by the strange, everyday rules that kept millions moving as one. And as the city settles fully into daylight, as footsteps echo along stone roads worn smooth by centuries of repetition, we begin our journey not into grand battles or emperors, but into the ordinary rules that ruled an extraordinary empire. In Rome, the day did not begin when a clock commanded it to begin. It began when the sky allowed it, before bells, before mechanical hours, before the idea of equal minutes. Romans lived by the movement of light. Time was not fixed. It stretched and shrank with the seasons, bending itself to the will of the sun. And because time shaped every action in Roman life, it became something regulated, respected, and quietly feared. At first light, the city stirred not because a signal sounded, but because habit demanded it. Laborers rose early, knowing that daylight was precious. Shopkeepers opened their doors as soon as shadows shortened. Slaves were already awake before dawn, preparing homes, lighting fires, and readying water for their masters. To waste daylight was to waste opportunity, and in Rome, wasted opportunity carried moral weight. Romans divided daylight into 12 hours and darkness into 12 more. But these hours were not equal. In summer, daylight hours were long and generous. In winter, they grew short and sharp. An hour in July stretched comfortably. An hour in December passed quickly, slipping away before work could be finished. Everyone knew this. Everyone adapted. Public sundials stood in forums and near temples, reminding citizens that time was shared, not personal. Later, water, clocks clepsydre measured. Passing hours indoors, their steady dripping reminding listeners that time flowed whether one wished it or not. Courts used them to limit speeches. Religious ceremonies relied on them for precision. Even debate was bound by time's rules. To ignore time was not rebellion. It was irresponsibility. Morning hours belonged to seriousness. Business was conducted early, when minds were fresh and heated not yet dulled concentration. Legal matters, political meetings, and formal greetings occurred before midday. A Roman of status was expected to appear early in public, visible and active. To sleep late suggested laziness, indulgence, or moral weakness. This expectation reached deep into social life. Patrons held morning receptions called salutatio, where clients arrived at dawn to offer respect and receive support. Arriving late was a quiet insult. Time here was hierarchy made visible. The early riser demonstrated discipline. The latecomer revealed his place. Even emperors were bound by this rhythm. Augustus himself was known to rise early, presenting his routine as a moral example. The message was clear. Rome ran best when its people honored the day. As the sun climbed higher, the nature of time shifted. The middle hours were slower. Meals were taken. Streets grew quieter. Work paused. In summer, rest was necessary, even enforced by custom. To push too hard against the heat was foolish, and Rome punished foolishness indirectly through illness, exhaustion, and public judgment. Then, as shadows lengthened, activity returned. The late afternoon allowed for social visits, bathing, and lighter business. Bathhouses filled with people who understood the unspoken rule. Cleanliness and conversation belonged to this hour. To bathe too early suggested indulgence. Too late suggested poor planning. Even leisure obeyed the clock. Night brought its own regulations. Rome did not sleep easily. Fires were a constant threat. Crime moved more freely in darkness, so the city restricted movement after sunset. Citizens were expected to remain indoors unless necessity demanded otherwise. Night watchmen patrolled streets, enforcing curfews and listening for trouble. Carrying a light at night was encouraged. Walking unseen invited suspicion. Certain professions were exceptions. Bakers worked through the night so bread would be ready at dawn. Night labor was allowed when it served the city. When it did not, it was discouraged. Time was not merely practical. It was sacred. Religious rituals required precision. Sacrifices had to be offered at specific hours. Omens were interpreted according to time of day. A prayer spoken too late could be considered invalid. A ceremony begun at the wrong hour might anger the gods. Priests watched the sky carefully, reading not only signs, but timing. Festivals followed calendars crowded with obligations. Days were marked as lawful or unlawful for business. On certain days, courts closed to markets slowed, and work was forbidden. These pauses were not indulgences. They were protections. Rome believed that denying the gods their proper time invited disaster. Thus, rest itself became regulated. Children learned this early. School began at first light. Lessons ended when the sun demanded it. Discipline included. In ancient Rome, clothing was never a simple matter of personal taste. What you wore announced who you were, where you belonged, and how much respect you deserved. A single garment could reveal your citizenship, your wealth, your moral standing, and even your political power. Roman society depended on visual clarity, and clothing laws ensured that hierarchy was immediately visible to everyone. From the moment a Roman stepped outside the home, their clothing placed them within the social order. This was not accidental. The state, tradition, and custom all worked together to regulate appearance, ensuring that no one could easily pretend to be something they were not. The most powerful symbol of status in Rome was the toga. This large, heavy garment was reserved almost exclusively for male Roman citizens. Slaves, foreigners, and most women were forbidden from wearing it. Simply appearing in public wearing a toga signaled legal identity and civic privilege. Without it, a man was visibly excluded from full participation in Roman life. Even among citizens, not all togas were equal. The toga vidalus, plain white and unadorned, marked adult male citizenship. Young boys wore a toga with a purple border until they reached maturity. Senators wore togas marked with a wide purple stripe, while equestrians had a narrower one. These distinctions were immediately recognizable and strictly enforced. Purple dye itself was heavily regulated, extracted from rare sea snails, and extremely expensive. Purple symbolized authority and power. Certain shades were reserved for emperors alone. Wearing unauthorized purple could result in confiscation of garments, fines, or even more serious punishment. Color, therefore, was not fashion, it was law. Women's clothing was equally regulated, though in different ways. Respectable Roman women wore the stola, a long garment that marked them as married and honorable. A woman seen without appropriate dress risked public judgment. Clothing was tied directly to morality. A woman who dressed immodestly could be accused of improper behavior, regardless of her actual conduct. Freed women and prostitutes were prohibited from wearing the stola. This visual separation ensured that social boundaries were never confused. The city depended on immediate recognition. One glance at a garment was meant to tell a full story about a person's place in society. Slaves wore simple tunics, often coarse and undecorated. Their clothing reinforced their status as property rather than individuals. A well-dressed slave reflected the wealth of their owner, not their own standing. Slaves were forbidden from imitating citizen dress, and violations could result in punishment for both slave and master. Footwear followed similar rules. Senators wore specific shoes with distinctive markings. Soldiers had standardized boots suited for long marches. Slaves often went barefoot. Even footwear communicated rank. In Rome, no detail was too small to regulate. Clothing laws extended into public spaces. Certain garments were required for specific occasions. Attendance at courts, religious ceremonies, or political gatherings demanded appropriate dress. Appearing improperly clothed could bar entry, damage reputation, or attract legal attention. Clothing was part of civic duty. Age also influenced clothing. Children wore garments that marked them as under protection. When a boy came of age and exchanged his childhood toga for the toga virilis, it was a public ritual. This transition announced his entry into civic life. Clothing marked life stages, clearly and publicly. Wealth brought additional layers of regulation. While rich Romans could afford fine fabrics, they were discouraged from excessive luxury. Sumptuary laws limited the amount of gold, silk, and ornamentation a person could wear. These laws aimed to preserve traditional values and prevent social resentment. Flaunting wealth too openly was seen as dangerous to social stability. Despite these laws, enforcement relied heavily on social pressure. Romans were keen observers. Gossip, ridicule, and public shame acted as powerful tools of control. A citizen who dressed above their station risked becoming a target of suspicion or mockery. Clothing mistakes were remembered. Military clothing followed its own strict codes. Uniformity reinforced discipline. Soldiers were expected to maintain their equipment and dress according to rank and unit. Failure to do so could signal weakness or disobedience. Military dress reinforced Rome's identity as a disciplined, organized power. Religious clothing was regulated with equal care. Priests wore distinctive garments during rituals. Certain colors and fabrics were reserved for sacred use. Improper attire during religious ceremonies was considered disrespectful to the gods and could invalidate rituals entirely. Clothing, therefore, carried spiritual consequences. Even mourning dress was regulated. Romans wore specific garments to mark grief. These visual signals informed others of appropriate behavior, limiting social interaction and expectations. Clothing communicated emotional state as well as status. Markets and public events revealed the effectiveness of these rules. In crowded forums, citizens could instantly identify officials, elites, soldiers, foreigners, and slaves. This visual system reduced conflict and confusion. Everyone knew who could speak, who could command, and who must obey. Clothing also controlled movement. Certain garments were impractical for manual labor, ensuring that elites remained visibly separate from workers. Tunics allowed freedom of motion, while togas restricted it. Clothing reinforced lifestyle as much as status. At home, rules were more flexible, but public appearance always demanded conformity. Romans changed clothing depending on context, understanding that garments were tools for navigating society. A citizen who failed to dress appropriately risked exclusion or punishment. Over time, these clothing laws became internalized. Romans learned instinctively what to wear and when. The rules no longer felt imposed. They felt natural. This internalization reduced the need for enforcement. Society policed itself. Through clothing, Rome maintained hierarchy without constant force. Fabric, color, and cut became instruments of control. Every citizen participated, consciously or not, in reinforcing the social order each time they dressed. What might seem restrictive to modern eyes was, for Rome, essential. In a city of millions, clarity mattered. Clothing ensured that identity was never ambiguous. It preserved order, reinforced authority, and reminded every individual of their place. In the next chapter, we move from appearance to appetite, exploring how eating, feasting, and dining rules shaped Roman society, controlled excess, and reinforced power at the table. In Rome, eating was never a simple act of hunger. It was watched. And more than anything, it was regulated. To modern minds, a meal is private, something done quietly, behind closed doors. But in the Roman world, eating revealed who you were, where you belonged, and whether you respected the order that kept the empire functioning. From the poorest laborer to the wealthiest senator, food followed rules. The Roman day began lightly. Breakfast, if it happened at all, was modest. A piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine. Olives, if one was fortunate. Heavy eating early in the day was frowned upon. It suggested lack of discipline. Rome admired restraint, especially in the morning hours when serious work was expected. The main meal came later, when the sun had already begun its descent. And this meal, the cena, was anything but casual. For the wealthy, the cena was a public performance disguised as hospitality. Guests reclined on couches arranged carefully around a low table. Seating was not random. Rank determined position. To recline closest to the host signaled favor. To be placed farther away announced your place in the social order. No one needed to explain this. Even the act of reclining itself was regulated. Free men reclined. Women sometimes did, depending on ERA and status. Slaves did not. They stood. They served. They watched, learning their master's habits intimately without ever participating. Food arrived in courses, not chaos. The order mattered. Eggs often came first, fruit last. To disrupt this sequence suggested ignorance. A guest who ate too eagerly, who reached before others, who drank too much tea, more acts were remembered. Rome did not forget such things. Conversation during meals followed its own rhythm. Politics might appear briefly, philosophy cautiously, gossip carefully. Loud argument was discouraged. A good guest enhanced harmony. A bad one disrupted balance, and balance, to Rome, was sacred. For the poor, meals looked very different, but rules still applied. Street food was common. Vendors sold bread, stews, and fried goods. Yet, even every behavior was observed. Eating while walking was considered improper. Meals were moments of pause, even if brief. To eat carelessly suggested desperation or moral weakness. Many Romans lived in small apartments without kitchens. They relied on public eateries. These spaces were regulated by custom more than law, but violations invited trouble. Disorder attracted attention. Attention attracted authority. Wine, too, followed strict expectations. Men were expected to drink, but not excessively. Moderation signaled control. Loss of control invited shame. Women, especially respectable women, were restricted from drinking wine in early Roman tradition. Though this rule softened over time, its moral shadow lingered. Drunkenness was tolerated only during festivals and, even then, within limits. Rome understood celebration, but feared chaos. Food itself carried moral weight. Certain foods were associated with simplicity and virtue, others with excess and corruption. Imported delicacies raised suspicion. Foreign tastes suggested foreign influence. Rome absorbed cultures slowly, cautiously, and always with resistance. Sumptuary laws reached the dining table as well. Limits were placed on how much could be spent on meals, how many guests could be invited, what foods could be served. These laws were often ignored by the elite, but their existence mattered. They declared value. Rome wanted its citizens to believe that excess weakened society. Religious rules entered meals quietly. Before eating, offerings were made to household gods. A small portion set aside, a brief prayer spoken. To eat without acknowledging the divine was dangerous not only spiritually, but socially. Neighbors noticed such neglect. Even leftovers had meaning. Waste was frowned upon. To discard food suggested arrogance toward fortune and the gods. Slaves experienced food as control. Their rations were calculated carefully, enough to sustain labor, rarely enough to satisfy. Overfeeding reduced discipline. Underfeeding risked rebellion. Masters learned this balance well. Food became one of the quiet tools of order. Children learned eating rules early. Sitting properly, waiting their turn, eating what was provided without complaint. A picky child reflected poorly on the household. Appetite was shaped into obedience. Public feasts marked political moments, victories, religious festivals, imperial generosity. These meals reinforced loyalty. But Ibn Ara's structure ruled. Portions were distributed carefully. Lines formed. Disorder was swiftly corrected. Rome believed that shared meals created shared identity, yet privacy at meals was rare. Servants watched. Guests observed one another. Reputation grew quietly, bite by bite. To eat too much suggested greed. Too little suggested disdain. The correct balance was admired. Even death entered dining rules. Mourning altered meals. Certain foods were avoided. Feasts, pauset, grief changed. Appetite, but only for a time. Extended refusal to return to normal meals raised concern. Rome expected recovery. Life, after all, must continue. In this way, eating became a mirror of Roman values. Discipline, hierarchy, moderation, visibility. No meal existed without meaning. As night approached and dining concluded, Romans prepared for another communal ritual, one that stripped away clothing, blurred class boundaries, and yet followed some of the strictest rules of all. For in Rome, even nakedness was regulated. And so we move next into steam, stone, and water, into the bathhouses, where daily life washed itself clean without ever losing its order. Rome endured for centuries, and much of that endurance was invisible. It was not solely the legions, the senators, or the monumental architecture that preserved the empire. Was the intricate web of rules governing everyday life. From bathing to sleep, from trade to entertainment, from family life to public speech, Romans lived under a system that balanced freedom with regulation, personal habits with social expectation, and private desire with civic duty. These rules were not arbitrary. They were the foundation of stability that allowed a sprawling, crowded, and diverse city on. Later an empire to function. The greatest achievement of Roman regulation was predictability. Citizens understood what to expect from streets, markets, public events, and households. Traffic patterns, noise limits, curfews, and sleep schedules all created a rhythm of life that minimized conflict and chaos. When millions of people shared space in densely packed cities, predictability was essential. By internalizing these rules from childhood through education, religious practice, and observation, Romans acted in ways that reinforced order without constant oversight. Hierarchy and social distinction were central to this system. Laws and customs defined roles: who could speak, who could move freely, who could marry, and who could participate in trade or ritual. Slaves, freedmen, citizens, men, women, children, all had defined expectations. By clearly outlining boundaries, Rome prevented confusion, friction, and instability. Even what might seem mundane, where a vendor set up, how a cart moved, how loudly someone spoke, was part of this invisible architecture of control. Religion reinforced compliance. Daily household rituals, temple ceremonies, and festival participation reminded citizens that their actions were observed not only by society but by the divine. Obedience was moral as well as civic. Missing a prayer, neglecting a rite, or failing to honor sacred norms carried both social and spiritual consequences. Religion, law, and social expectation worked together to maintain cohesion. Education ensured continuity. From early childhood, Romans were trained to follow rules, anticipate consequences, and respect hierarchy. Schools, apprenticeships, and household instruction produced citizens who internalized the empire's values and understood their role within it. Knowledge itself became a mechanism of control. To understand the laws and customs was to participate correctly in society, while ignorance risked exclusion or failure. Commerce thrived because of regulation. Markets operated predictably. Trade followed clear protocols, and goods were monitored for fairness and quality. Rules governed timing, pricing, and behavior, ensuring that the economy could sustain a massive population. Even entertainment, often thought of as leisure, served as a controlled space for social reinforcement. Gladiatorial games, theater, festivals, and public celebrations combined enjoyment with hierarchy, timing, and behavioral expectation. Citizens participated, observed, and learned the limits of acceptable behavior. The control of noise, traffic, and public movement was equally important. Rome's streets, often chaotic to outsiders, were governed by tacit rules that citizens understood intuitively. Nighttime curfews, designated cart routes, and pedestrian pathways reduced accidents and disorder. Even sleep and rest were regulated, shaping household routines and public safety. Obedience was instilled in every corner of daily life, creating a city that functioned predictably despite its size and density. Family life and sexual behavior were regulated to sustain the empire itself. Marriage, inheritance, and the legitimacy of children were state concerns. Laws encouraged citizen marriage, monitored adultery, and rewarded families that contributed to the population and social stability. Sexual behavior was guided by hierarchy, gender, and status, ensuring that the structure of households aligned with the empire's goals. By controlling private life, Rome strengthened the public order that depended on predictable households, inheritance, and citizen responsibility. Even punishment and law enforcement contributed to stability. Visible public punishments, fines, and court proceedings reinforced social norms, while informal mechanisms gossip reputation. Pure observation maintained compliance quietly. Citizens learned quickly that deviation carried consequences, and the empire leveraged both fear and social expectation to regulate millions effectively. The cumulative effect of these rules was subtle yet powerful. Rome did not need constant coercion to maintain order. Its citizens had internalized the structures of behavior, rhythm, and expectation. The result was a city and an empire that could function efficiently, adapt to crises, and absorb diverse peoples and cultures. Boundaries and discipline became invisible infrastructure, as essential to the empire as roads, aqueducts, and walls. The legacy of Roman regulation endured long after the empire's political and military collapse. Medieval cities, modern legal systems, urban planning, and civic rituals all carry echoes of Roman thought. The understanding that order, predictability, and structured behavior are necessary for society to function. Rome's genius was not only in conquest or construction, it was in designing a civilization where daily life itself reinforced stability, hierarchy, and continuity. Every bathhouse rule, every market regulation, every expectation of silence, obedience, and ritual contributed to an invisible architecture of control. Romans followed routines not only to survive, but to live in a city that demanded participation, conformity, and awareness. It was this careful balance between freedom and regulation, individuality and hierarchy, private desire and public duty that allowed one of history's largest empires to endure for centuries. And so, when we reflect on Roman daily life, we see more than strange customs, rules, or rituals. We see a civilization built on discipline, observation, an expectation society in which the ordinary behaviors of millions, from waking to sleeping, from trade to leisure, were all woven into a framework that preserved order. The empire's power lay not just in armies or politics, but in the invisible yet meticulous control of life itself. Rome survived because its people knew how to act, when to act, and how to obey, often without thinking. That was the true genius of the empire, the subtle mastery of the everyday. And with this, the story of Rome's peculiar daily rules, the invisible architecture of life, and the foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations comes to a close. Rome was never a quiet city. From sunrise to nightfall, sound filled its streets. Footsteps echoed on stone roads. Vendors called out their goods. Metal rang from workshops. Animals moved through alleys. Voices overlapped constantly. Noise was part of Roman life, but it was not uncontrolled. Rome understood something essential. Sound could either sustain order or destroy it. And so, even noise followed rules. Certain sounds were accepted, even expected. Others were restricted, discouraged, or punished. The city did not seek Silenciate sought balance. Daytime noise was tolerated because work demanded it. Construction projects reshaped the city continuously. Hammers struck stone. Carts rolled over uneven roads. Labro announced itself loudly. To complain about daytime noise was considered unreasonable. Rome valued productivity. But nighttime was different. After sunset, the city tightened its expectations. Loud activity during the night drew attention quickly. Night watchmen patrolled streets, listening for disturbances. Shouting, fighting, or excessive noise after dark suggested crime or disorder. Those responsible could be fined, detained, or questioned. Rome feared what could not be seen. Fires were a constant danger. Loud noises at night distracted watchmen. Chaos delayed response. Silence improved safety. For this reason, many activities were restricted after dark, not by written law alone, but by enforced custom. Carts were one of the most regulated sources of sound. Heavy wagons were banned from the city during daylight hours. The noise and congestion they caused disrupted daily life. Instead, carts moved at night when streets were quieter and movement easier. This created an unusual rhythm. Rome slept while goods moved, and woke while commerce paused. The result was efficiency, not convenience. Markets followed sound rules as well. Vendors could call out, but not excessively. Deceptive shouting, false claims, or deliberate disruption attracted punishment. Markets were meant to function smoothly. Too much noise confused buyers and slowed trade. Public speeches followed time and sound restrictions. Speakers and forums were expected to project clearly but not endlessly. Overly long or aggressive speeches were discouraged. Rome valued persuasion, not domination. In courts, water clocks limited speech time. Sound here was controlled carefully. Justice depended on order. Music existed everywhere, yet even music had boundaries. Festivals allowed loud celebration. Religious ceremonies included instruments and chanting, but outside approved occasions, music played too loudly could invite complaint. Musicians understood this. Many played in specific districts, at specific hours. Their livelihood depended on staying within accepted limits. Domestic noise mattered too. In apartment buildings, residents shared walls, floors, and courtyards. Excessive noise caused disputes. Tenants who disturbed neighbors risked eviction or fines. Landlords preferred order. Rome's density made cooperation necessary. Children were corrected early for uncontrolled noise. Loud, unruly behavior reflected poorly on parents. Discipline extended beyond obedience. It included volume. Slaves were expected to move quietly. Loud mistakes attracted punishment. Silence signaled efficiency and submission. Sound, again, revealed hierarchy. Religious sound was protected. Prayers, chants, and ritual music were respected even when loud. Interrupting a ceremony was dangerous, not only socially, but spiritually. Romans believed improper sound could offend the gods. Certain sounds carried legal weight. Trumpets announced official actions. Bells marked public events. These sounds demanded attention. Ignoring them carried consequences. Silence itself had meaning. A quiet crowd suggested respect. A quiet street at night suggested safety. Silence was not emptiness, it was order achieved. Foreign visitors often found Rome overwhelming. The noise was constant. But Romans learned to interpret it. They knew which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. In this way, the city spoke continuously. Its citizens listened carefully. Noise laws were rarely dramatic. They were enforced through habit, warning, and social pressure more than violence. A reputation for disturbance followed a person quietly and followed them everywhere. Rome believed that control of sound reflected control of society. Too much noise meant loss of restraint. Too little meant stagnation. The balance mattered. As evening settled and voices lowered, as carts began to roll and footsteps thinned, the city prepared for rest under watchful ears. But sound was only one way. Rome regulated movement. The next rules shaped bodies themselves, who could walk where, how fast, and with what authority. For Rome's streets were crowded, narrow, and powerful. and movement within them was never free. In Rome, private life was never fully private. Marriage, intimacy, and family were not left to personal choice alone. They were matters of state concern. Rome believed that the stability of the empire depended on the structure of households, the legitimacy of children, and the moral behavior of citizens. For this reason, the government reached deeply into areas that modern societies often consider personal. Marriage was encouraged, regulated, and rewarded. Roman law viewed marriage as a civic duty rather than a romantic ideal. A married citizen contributed to social order. An unmarried one raised concern. The state wanted families because families produced heirs, workers, and soldiers. Vaetuth tem. Rome weakened. Under Emperor Augustus, this belief became law. Citizens of certain ages were expected to marry. Those who did not could face penalties. Unmarried adults were restricted in inheritance rights. Married couples with children received advantages. These laws were not symbolic. They shaped real decisions. Marriage itself followed strict rules. Legal marriage required citizenship status, proper consent, and social compatibility. Certain unions were forbidden. Senators, for example, were barred from marrying freedwomen or actresses. Such relationships blurred class boundaries, and Rome feared that confusion. Women entered marriage under legal structures that defined power clearly. Some remained under the authority of their fathers. Others passed into the authority of their husbands. Though practices changed over time, the expectation remained. Marriage created order through hierarchy. Sexual behavior was also regulated, but unevenly. Roman society judged actions not only by morality, but by role. Free adult male citizens were granted wide latitude, provided they maintained control and dominance. Losing control or appearing submissive invited shame. Sexual behavior that threatened status was condemned more harshly than behavior that violated abstract morality. Women faced stricter scrutiny. A married woman was expected to be sexually faithful. Adultery was not a private failing. It was a public offense. Under Augustan law, a husband was required to divorce an adulterous wife and report her. Failure to do so implicated him as well. Punishments could include exile, loss of property, and public disgrace. The purpose was deterrence, not compassion. Rome believed fear preserved order. Men were not judged equally. Adultery laws applied differently depending on status. A man's affair with a prostitute or slave was often tolerated. An affair with another man's wife was not. The issue was ownership and household integrity, not desire. Prostitution itself was legal but regulated. Prostitutes were registered and taxed. They were barred from certain clothing and honors. Their status was clearly marked to prevent confusion with respectable women. Rome preferred regulated vice to hidden disorder. Slaves existed outside most sexual protections. Their bodies were legally controlled by their owners. Yet even era limits existed. Abuse that caused unrest or harmed productivity was discouraged. Again, order-guided restraint. Children were the focus of strict protection. Sexual exploitation of freeborn children was condemned harshly. The future of Rome depended on legitimate heirs. Threatening that future invited severe punishment. Divorce was permitted and relatively easy. This flexibility served stability. An unhappy marriage could dissolve without violence, yet divorce carried social consequences. Reputation mattered. Frequent divorce suggested instability. Widowhood came with expectations. Widows were encouraged to remarry within a certain period. Extended refusal raised concern. The state valued continuity over mourning. Homosexual relationships existed openly, but within unspoken rules. As long as a free male citizen maintained dominance and avoided dishonor, society often looked away. Again, role mattered more than orientation. Public discussion of sex was common, but modesty was expected in behavior. Explicit acts in public were forbidden. Rome separated openness of speech from restraint of action. Religion reinforced these norms. Household rituals emphasized fertility and legitimacy. Gods associated with marriage and childbirth were honored regularly. Failure to perform these rituals suggested neglect of duty. Marriage contracts included dowries, obligations, and expectations. These were practical documents, not romantic promises. They ensured financial stability and clarified responsibility. Parents arranged many marriages. Personal preference mattered less than alliance, property, and status. Love might grow later. Rome did not rely on emotion to build families. Even clothing reflected sexual regulation. Married women dressed differently. Their appearance signaled respectability. Deviation invited suspicion. Social pressure enforced these rules more effectively than courts. Gossip traveled quickly. Reputation shaped opportunity. A family known for scandal suffered quietly but deeply. Rome understood that controlling desire was impossible, but directing it was achievable. By defining acceptable behavior, rewarding conformity, and punishing disruption, the state shaped intimate life without constant force. Marriage produced heirs. Sexual regulation protected households. Children ensured continuity. These were not moral choices alone. They were strategic ones. As households stabilized, the empire rested on firm foundations: quiet homes, predictable inheritance, and disciplined citizens. But not everyone lived under these rules equally. Some existed within Roman homes, yet outside Roman families entirely, and it was through slavery that Rome maintained much of its daily order. That is where we turn next. Rome was built on labor it did not fully acknowledge. Slaves were everywhere in homes, workshops, farms, offices, and temples. They cooked meals, cleaned floors, taught children, managed accounts, and carried messages across the city. Without them, Roman daily life would have slowed to a halt. Yet despite their constant presence, slaves existed behind a set of invisible boundaries that defined what they could do, where they could go, and how they could be treated. These boundaries were not always written in law. Most were enforced through habit, fear, and shared understanding. Legally, slaves were property. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or punished at their owner's discretion. This reality shaped every interaction. A slave's body, time, and labor belonged to someone else. Even their name often changed to reflect ownership. But Rome did not allow unlimited cruelty. The empire understood that excessive abuse created instability. A mistreated slave was less productive and more likely to rebel. History had taught Rome hard lessons through uprisings and revolts. As a result, informal limits developed, supported gradually by law. Masters were expected to maintain control without chaos. Public punishment was discouraged, unless necessary. Executing slaves without reason attracted attention and suspicion. Killing one's own slave was legal in early Rome, but over time, restrictions emerged. The state began to intervene when cruelty threatened order. Social expectations mattered. A master known for excessive violence earned a dangerous reputation. Others avoided him. His household was considered unstable. Rome valued predictability, even in domination. Slaves followed strict behavioral rules. Eye contact was limited. Speech was cautious. Movement was controlled. A slave who spoke too freely risked punishment. Silence signaled obedience. Yet silence did not mean absence of skill. Many slaves were highly educated. Some served as tutors, doctors, scribes, and administrators. These roles carried responsibility but not freedom. Authority could be exercised only in the master's name. A slave's competence enhanced the household's status, but never their own. Dress reinforced boundaries. Slaves wore simple clothing. Distinctive garments were avoided to prevent confusion with free citizens. At one point, proposals were made to force slaves to wear identifying outfits. These were rejected not out of mercy, but fear. If slaves recognized their own numbers, rebellion might follow. Thus, invisibility became policy. Slaves moved through the city constantly, yet rarely drew attention. They ran errands, accompanied masters, and handled daily logistics. Their presence was normal. Their individuality was not. Public spaces carried rules for slave behavior. Slaves did not recline at meals. They stood or waited. In bathhouses, their access depended on their master's permission. Some bathed late at night, others not at all. Marriage among slaves was not legally recognized. Families could be separated without notice. Children inherited slave status automatically. The system discouraged attachment, but attachment still formed, quietly and painfully. Manumission offered hope. Some slaves earned, or were granted freedom. Freedmen gained limited rights, but boundaries remained. They owed loyalty to former masters. Their clothing, names, and behavior reflected this status. Freed slaves were expected to act with gratitude and restraint. Arrogance invited backlash. Rome tolerated social movement but controlled it carefully. Slaves were punished for crimes differently than free citizens. Testimony under torture was accepted. Legal protections were minimal, yet even order mattered. Random violence threatened trust in the system. Household rituals included slaves indirectly. They witnessed prayers, festivals, and sacrifices without participating fully. Religion reminded them of hierarchy as much as belonging. Children in Roman households grew up alongside slaves. They learned command early. This normalized inequality. Authority became instinctive. Despite harsh realities, Rome depended on cooperation as much as fear. A functioning household required trust. Slaves managed finances, guarded secrets, and raised children. Total repression would have failed. So Rome balanced cruelty with restraint. The boundaries between master and slave were firm but not always visible. A nod, a gesture, a lowered gaze, these signs replaced constant force. This system allowed millions to coexist in close quarters without constant rebellion. But Rome did not rely only on household control. Outside, in the streets and pathways between homes, another set of rules shaped daily order rules about movement itself. Because in a city this crowded, how you moved mattered as much as who you were, and those rules governed everyone. Rome's streets were never empty. They were narrow, crowded, and alive with constant movement. Pedestrians jostled with merchants, carts, soldiers, animals, and delivery runners. The city thrived on motion, but motion alone was not enough. Without regulation, chaos would have overtaken Rome long before any invader arrived. Movement in the city followed rules, many unwritten but widely understood. Streets had functions assigned by habit, law, and necessity. Certain roads were designated for carts, others for foot traffic. Heavy wagons were forbidden during daylight hours to reduce congestion and accidents. Merchants timed their deliveries to avoid peak pedestrian hours. Everyone adjusted, often instinctively. Carts carried goods, but also danger. Collisions could crush pedestrians. Noise from wheels disrupted conversation, negotiations, and sleep. Rome's response was practical. Restrict heavy carts to early morning or late evening. This simple law allowed millions to navigate safely during the day. Pedestrians had their own responsibilities. Walking in the wrong lane, blocking doorways, or straying into cart paths drew warnings. The city relied on social pressure more than policing. Reputation mattered. A man who ignored these rules risked gossip, insult, or fines. Animals added complexity. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and even dogs moved through streets daily. Their handlers had obligations. Livestock could not roam freely. They had to follow paths and avoid market congestion. Stray animals were captured and sometimes punished. Safety and predictability mattered more than compassion. Public spaces required careful attention. Forums, temples, and markets were crowded at nearly all hours. Citizens learned to anticipate traffic patterns. To step into the forum at the wrong time, or cut across busy areas without awareness, was seen as disrespectful. Rome valued order and shared space as much as in law. Street vendors operated under restrictions. Calling out too loudly, placing goods in the road, or blocking access to water fountains could result in fines or removal. Vendors were essential, but they had to coexist with the city's wider rhythm. Night brought stricter controls. Movement after dark was limited for safety. The city deployed watchmen to monitor streets and alleyways. Citizens were advised to travel in pairs or with torches. Unauthorized movement risked arrest or questioning. Noise, light, and direction of travel were all scrutinized to prevent accidents, theft, or fires. Even festivals and public gatherings followed traffic rules. Parades moved in predetermined paths. Spectators stayed behind ropes or barriers. Disorderly crowd behavior could result in arrests. Rome preferred celebration with predictability. A disorderly street was not entertainment, it was risk. Private buildings reinforced these rules. Doorways, staircases, and courtyards were structured to guide movement. Apartments and homes shared walls and passages, so residents had to navigate carefully. Slaves, children, and adults alike learned to coordinate their steps. Minor mistakes were corrected quickly through instruction or social pressure. Rome also monitored city entrances. Gates regulated incoming traffic. Merchants, travelers, and officials had designated hours and inspection points. Movement into and out of the city was carefully timed to prevent congestion and crime. This system allowed Rome to function as a metropolis while maintaining safety and order. Even during emergencies, movement followed expectation. Fires, floods, or invasions required citizens to act according to plans, not panic. Assigned streets and exits saved lives. Disorder could be fatal. Training, repetition, and knowledge of rules were essential. Ultimately, Roman streets were a microcosm of the empire itself. They demanded cooperation, observation, and adherence to boundaries. Carts, pedestrians, animals, and vendors coexisted not by chance, but because everyone understood the rules and the consequences for breaking them. Order was visible in motion. Control was enforced through routine, reputation, and law. The rhythm of traffic reflected the rhythm of the city, balancing human needs with safety, commerce, and efficiency. And as citizens navigated these streets successfully day after day, the city's structure reinforced another layer of regulation. The sacred, the divine, and the invisible rules of religion. Because in Rome, even the gods expected obedience, and their laws guided daily life just as firmly as the traffic laws that kept millions moving safely through the city. In Rome, religion was not optional. It was embedded in every corner of life, guiding citizens' actions, behavior, and even their thoughts. Unlike many modern societies, where faith may be private, in Rome it was public, regulated, and inseparable from civic duty. Household rituals were central. Every home contained a small shrine, often dedicated to the Lares and Paenates, the protective household gods. The paterfamilias, head of the family, was responsible for daily offerings. These were small acts: pouring wine, burning incense, reciting prayers. Missing a single day was not considered trivial. It suggested negligence and risked divine disfavor for the entire household. Public temples reinforced these habits. Citizens attended sacrifices, festivals, and ceremonies at predictable intervals. Each action was timed according to the calendar, the position of the sun, and the alignment of omens. Priests monitored these practices, ensuring consistency. Deviating from the expected ritual schedule could bring social censure or worse. Religion also enforced morality. Certain behaviors were directly linked to piety. Respecting elders, maintaining honesty in trade, controlling appetite and desire, these were as much spiritual duties as social ones. Immorality was thought to offend both the gods and the state. The calendar dictated work and rest. Days were marked as lawful or unlawful for commerce, depending on which deity was honored. On certain festival days, courts closed, markets slowed, and ordinary labor ceased. Romans learned to anticipate these pauses, adjusting their lives to fit the sacred rhythm. Work done on the wrong day could attract fines or disapproval. Augury and divination played practical roles. Priests and specialists observed birds, celestial events, and animal entrails to interpret omens. Leaders consulted them before military campaigns, construction projects, or major decisions. Even private citizens sought signs before marriage or investment. Timing, like in traffic and work, had a spiritual component. Acting without it was seen as reckless. Public ceremonies demanded precise behavior. Citizens entering a temple followed set paths, wore specific clothing, and performed prescribed gestures. Disturbing the ritual, speaking out of turn, or arriving late was socially dangerous. Religious etiquette was as much about demonstrating obedience to society as to the gods. Sacred spaces influenced everyday conduct. Streets leading to temples were kept clear, altars maintained, and offerings placed visibly. The city's layout reflected devotion. In a sense, walking through Rome was an act of participation in a constant, communal ritual. Even personal milestones were religiously framed. Births, marriages, and deaths were accompanied by ceremonies and offerings. Children's naming, initiation into adulthood, and entry into public life involved ritualized acts designed to integrate individuals into society as moral and spiritual order. Slaves participated indirectly. They prepared altars, carried offerings, and witnessed ceremonies. Their obedience in these tasks reinforced social hierarchy. Even their labor had sacred significance, linking utility with devotion. Religious laws also enforced social boundaries. Certain temples and ceremonies were restricted to citizens. Foreigners and slaves had limited access. Violating these rules was not merely a spiritual offense, was a legal one, punishable by fines or removal from public spaces. Festivals offered moments of collective participation. Citizens celebrated, feasted, and performed dances, songs, and plays. Yet even in these lively events, structure was maintained. The city's organization, paths, schedules, and designated spaces ensured safety and order. Excessive noise or disorder could prompt intervention from magistrates or watchmen. Ultimately, religion in Rome was inseparable from obedience. It reinforced hierarchy, discipline, and civic responsibility. By integrating ritual into daily life, the city ensured that citizens practiced self-control, respect, and attentiveness. Through devotion, Romans learned order. Through ritual, they internalized boundaries. Through participation, they maintained the stability of an empire that relied on millions following rules. Invisible yet powerful, and as day turned toward evening, as temples emptied and lamps flickered in household shrines, Romans prepared for another regulated, communal practice: entertainment, leisure, and public spectacle. Even fun had rules. In Rome, leisure was never entirely free. It was structured, observed, and regulated, just like every other aspect of daily life. The empire understood that fun could strengthen society if guided carefully or disrupt it entirely if left unchecked. Theaters, amphitheaters, and circuses were the primary stages of public entertainment. Citizens attended performances in large numbers, yet entry, seating, and behavior were all controlled. Tickets, or tokens, often dictated placement. The wealthy and influential received the best seats. Ordinary citizens filled the back, and standing in the wrong area could provoke censure. Order in seating reflected order in society. Spectacles themselves followed rules. Gladiatorial games were organized carefully by magistrates or wealthy patrons. Each match, combatant, and animal had an assigned place and role. Crowd behavior was managed by guards and ushers. Shouting, invading the arena, or attempting to influence outcomes was prohibited. Chaos threatened not just enjoyment, but safety. The content of performances was also monitored. Plays and shows needed approval to ensure they aligned with Roman values. Political criticism, excessive mockery, or moral impropriety could be punished. Entertainment reinforced hierarchy, virtue, and civic obedience. Bathhouses, as we have seen, were also social centers for leisure. Beyond washing, they offered exercise, games, and conversation. Even here, participation followed rules. Physical activity was regulated by space and timing. Too much rowdiness invited rebuke. Certain areas were reserved for particular ranks or ages, preserving visible boundaries. Feasts, festivals, and public celebrations were another form of structured recreation. These events allowed relaxation, but within precise constraints. Dates, times, and rituals were scheduled to honor the gods, maintain civic order, and prevent accidents. Wine and food consumption were expected to remain moderate. Excessive indulgence could be punished socially or legally. Music and poetry were integral to leisure. Street performers and public musicians entertained audiences under time and space regulations. Loud noise outside designated hours or locations could prompt intervention. Performance was permitted but always within boundaries that protected order. Games and gambling were tolerated but controlled. Dice, betting, and board games had rules that participants were expected to follow. Disputes were often mediated by public officials. Chaos during games threatened social harmony. Even children's play was supervised indirectly. Families expected children to learn boundaries in public spaces. Running, shouting, or roughhousing in inappropriate locations reflected poorly on parents. Play was important, but never entirely free from observation. Athletic competitions were organized similarly. Stadiums or open fields designated who could compete, in which order, and under what rules. Victories, prizes, and recognition reinforced status and adherence to civic discipline. Cheating or stepping outside accepted rules was publicly condemned. Theaters, circuses, and amphitheaters also served political purposes. Emperors and magistrates used spectacles to demonstrate generosity, reward loyalty, and showcase authority. The audience's behavior was monitored. Excessive dissent or disruption could be punished. Even applause and shouting had expected timing and intensity. Private leisure, while more flexible, also followed social expectation. Wealthy households offered reading, music, or conversation, but guests were expected to behave politely. Improper conduct could damage reputation quietly but significantly. Rome understood that unregulated leisure could threaten discipline. Citizens who misused free time might neglect work, disrespect law, or cause public disorder. Consequently, the city balanced enjoyment with expectation. Rules guided action without entirely suppressing pleasure. Even humor and satire had limits. Comedians, writers, and performers could entertain, but crossing moral or political boundaries brought intervention. Laughter was permitted but carefully monitored. In this way, Roman entertainment maintained societal cohesion. Fun was a tool for reinforcing hierarchy, teaching obedience, and sharing cultural values. By controlling space, timing, and behavior, the empire ensured that leisure strengthened society rather than undermining it. As the sun set and audiences left amphitheaters, the city prepared for the quietest hours. Night brought rest, reflection, and preparation for another regulated day. Sleep itself, like every action in Rome, followed expectation. Next, we turn to chapter 12, where we will explore sleep, rest, and the rules that governed the final hours of a Roman day. In Rome, even sleep was governed by expectation, custom, and practical necessity. It was not a purely private act. How, when, and where citizens rested reflected discipline, hierarchy, and social order. The empire understood that the city's survival depended not only on work, religion, and law, but also on the careful management of rest. Sleep in Rome followed the natural rhythm of daylight. The rising sun dictated waking, the setting sun suggested rest. Unlike modern cities with artificial lighting, Romans experienced time physically. Candlelight and oil lamps existed but were expensive and limited. Most citizens retired soon after nightfall. Slaves often worked later, performing chores that extended beyond the household's visible activity. While the elite might read or discuss business by lamplight, the paterfamilias, or head of the household, was responsible for enforcing routine. Children, servants, and younger adults were expected to follow his schedule. Late-night wanderers were rare. A citizen seen out after dark without a legitimate reason risked suspicion, social judgment, or even intervention by the night watch. In T-Sensi, sleep was public in its regulation, if not in its experience. Household preparation for sleep was systematic. Beds were arranged according to status. Wealthier Romans slept on raised frames with mattresses stuffed with reeds, wool, or feathers. Less wealthy families used straw mats. Slaves often rested on the floor, in dormitory-like spaces, or in the kitchen area. Where one slept, how one slept, and with whom were all regulated by rank, family custom, and practicality. The timing of sleep was crucial. Disruption of the sleep cycle was socially frowned upon. Those who consistently rose late were considered lazy, undisciplined, or morally weak. In contrast, those who awoke early demonstrated self-control and virtue. The rhythm of sleep was tied not only to health, but also to social perception. Citizens internalized these rules from childhood. Public safety further reinforced sleep regulation. Watchmen patrolled streets at night, protecting citizens from fire, theft, and attack. Their presence implied that leaving the home at night without necessity was unwise. Citizens carried torches or lamps when venturing out, both for personal safety and as a visible signal of intent. In an environment without streetlights, darkness was dangerous, and the city's survival relied on citizens understanding their boundaries. Sleep hygiene, by Roman standards, was as much about discipline as comfort. Houses were kept relatively clean, bedding was maintained, and rooms were aired when possible. Wealthy citizens sometimes placed small braziers or lamps in bedrooms for warmth, but they were monitored carefully to prevent fire. The risk of conflagration was constant, and a careless flame could devastate a neighborhood. Safety rules shaped even private spaces. Children were taught routines carefully. Evening meals, bathing, household rituals, and study all concluded before bedtime. This prepared them for sleep, reinforced discipline, and trained them to respect structure. Improper rests like improper study or late-night play could mark a child's reputation early. Discipline extended into the subconscious, shaping adulthood. Slave sleep schedules were determined entirely by their masters. They often rose before dawn and worked after dusk. Rest was allocated strategically to preserve labor efficiency while maintaining obedience. A well-rested slave was more productive. A poorly rested one risked errors or rebellion. Mastery over the household extended even into the sleeping hours. Nighttime rituals were as important as daytime routines. Lamps or small fires were maintained to facilitate preparation for the following day. Prayers or offerings were sometimes performed before sleep, reinforcing the idea that divine oversight extended into rest. Skipping these rituals could suggest negligence or sleep was a civic, domestic, and spiritual duty all at once. Wealth influenced sleeping arrangements further. Multiple bedrooms, private chambers, and separate sleeping areas allowed discretion and comfort. In smaller homes, families shared spaces. Order was maintained through custom. The paterfamilias and mother slept in the primary area, children in side rooms or communal spaces, and servants on the periphery. Spatial arrangement reflected hierarchy even during rest. Health and medicine intersected with sleep. Doctors advised citizens on the timing, duration, and environment of rest. Excessive activity late at night, poor air circulation, or exposure to dampness were warned against. Remedies existed for insomnia or discomfort, yet they were also regulated by knowledge, availability, and social practice. Sleep was both natural and structured. Nighttime curfews applied in some cases. Certain neighborhoods, especially crowded or dangerous districts, imposed restrictions on movement after dark. Soldiers, officials, and the wealthy might have exemptions, but the average citizen adhered to local expectation. Breaking curfew could invite fines, reprimand, or arrest. Sleep, in this sense, was enforced indirectly by the threat of public consequences. Public and private noises were carefully managed during nighttime. Household activity was minimized. Carts and trade were mostly suspended. Street cleaning was delayed until morning. Sleep depended on quiet, which depended on order. The city's ability to function the next day relied on citizens respecting this enforced calm. Even festivals and special occasions respected sleep indirectly. Feasts might continue later, but organizers were expected to contain noise. The city understood that disruption of rest could undermine health, order, and reputation. Celebration was permitted but structured. Religious observances also intersected with rest. Certain festivals involved nighttime rituals. Citizens might rise at unusual hours for ceremonies, guided by priests and calendars. These events were exceptional, not routine, emphasizing that even sleep had socially acceptable interruptions. Compliance reinforced community cohesion. In households where illness or injury existed, sleeping patterns shifted. The sick were given extra space, blankets, or attention. Children were comforted. Slaves might adjust schedules to provide care. Even exceptions followed hierarchy. Those with authority determined rules for rest and recovery. Dreams, while private, were sometimes interpreted publicly. A vivid or ominous dream could be discussed with family or a priest. Warnings or predictions drawn from dreams influenced action the following day. Sleep, therefore, had consequences extending beyond the night itself. Ultimately, Rome treated sleep as part of the larger system of social regulation. Obedience, hierarchy, and responsibility extended into unconscious hours. The city functioned because citizens internalized rules governing work, religion, leisure, and rest. Disruption of one part could ripple across the whole system. By respecting the natural cycle of day and night, by maintaining order in sleeping arrangements, and by observing both private and public expectations, Romans preserved both individual well-being and collective stability. Rest was productive, sleep was functional, and even the unconscious hours were disciplined, observed, and meaningful. As the city slumbered, streets emptied, lamps dimmed, and the night watch remained alert. Rome prepared quietly for another day. The next sunrise would bring work, ritual, and order once again. Every citizen, from the wealthiest patrician to the lowest slave, played a role. Sleep was merely another stage of civic life, regulated, essential part of the empire's daily rhythm. In the following chapter, we will examine commerce, markets, and trade regulations, the structures that ensured the economy ran smoothly under the watchful eyes of laws, customs, and expectations. In Rome, commerce was the lifeblood of the city. Markets hummed with activity. Goods traveled from distant provinces, and citizens depended on a steady flow of food, materials, and luxury items. But unlike modern marketplaces, Roman commerce was heavily regulated. The empire understood that trade could either strengthen society or destabilize it, and laws, customs, and social expectation ensured that order prevailed. Markets were organized carefully. Each forum or plaza had designated sections for specific goods: bread, olives, wine, textiles, and livestock. Merchants were expected to stay within their assigned spaces. Moving into another section without permission could spark disputes and even fines. This separation of commerce reduced conflict and allowed buyers to navigate efficiently. Prices were monitored. Though bargaining was common, there were limits. Certain goods, especially staple foods like grain, were subject to maximum pricing rules. Officials or guild representatives sometimes intervened to prevent speculation or exploitation. In times of shortage, rules became stricter. Food hoarding was illegal and punished severely. Vendors themselves followed behavioral expectations, calling out excessively, misrepresenting goods, or engaging in aggressive sales tactics was forbidden. Markets were lively, but orderly. Noise, like in other parts of the city, was tolerated only within boundaries. Citizens relied on these structures to identify trustworthy sellers and protect their own safety. Weights and measures were standardized. Buyers could inspect scales, and deception carried legal consequences. Uniformity allowed trust to flourish. Without it, commerce would falter, and the city would suffer. Slaves often participated in trade under supervision. They carried goods, handled coins, and ran errands. Their labor extended the reach of the marketplace, but boundaries were strict. They could not make independent transactions, and mismanagement could result in punishment. Their role ensured efficiency while maintaining social hierarchy. Guilds and trade associations influenced regulations. Craftsmen of similar trades banded together to enforce quality standards, limit competition, and provide mutual oversight. This system allowed for specialization without chaos. A poorly made product could damage reputation, so guilds enforced standards rigorously. Transport of goods followed rules similar to traffic regulations. Wagons and carts were timed to avoid congestion. Certain roads were restricted to specific types of loads. Livestock moved along designated paths. Merchants, drivers, and officials all coordinated to prevent accidents. Efficiency and safety were paramount. Taxes and tariffs were integral to commerce. Traders paid fees for entry into markets, licenses to sell, and duties on imported goods. These revenues funded infrastructure, security, and public events. Collection was methodical, and evasion carried penalties. Rome understood that regulated trade supported not only the economy but also the social structure. Public auctions were another regulated aspect of commerce. Goods, land, and even slaves were sold under careful supervision. Auctioneers followed rules regarding bidding order, time, and transparency. Manipulating outcomes was illegal and socially condemned. Auctions reinforced hierarchy and trust while providing opportunities for wealth and influence. Market festivals, while celebratory, were also structured. Seasonal events introduced exotic goods, performers, and large crowds. Authorities coordinated entry, stalls, and schedules to prevent disorder. Rules ensured enjoyment without chaos, preserving both commerce and safety. Food supply, the most vital part of commerce, was closely monitored. Grain, Oil and wine were essential for survival. Disruptions in supply could provoke unrest. Officials enforced storage, distribution, and pricing rules strictly. Public granaries ensured stability, and any merchant hoarding or misrepresenting essentials risked severe punishment. Even religious oversight influenced commerce. Temples sometimes functioned as centers of trade or guaranteed contracts. Merchants offered sacrifices for profitable transactions, reinforcing the idea that trade was both practical and spiritual. Religious observances marked certain days when trade was limited, emphasizing the integration of economy and ritual. Children observed markets early, learning behavior, currency handling, and social norms. Participation was educational. Slaves and apprentices gained practical experience while understanding boundaries. Mistakes were corrected immediately, teaching discipline and respect for regulations. Foreign merchants were subject to particular scrutiny. Permissions, taxes, and identification were required. Rome absorbed goods and cultures gradually, ensuring foreign influence did not disrupt domestic order. The city was cosmopolitan, but careful openness had limits. Finally, commerce extended beyond the marketplace into households. Domestic production, small workshops, and services operated under similar principles. Accountability, honesty, and skill were expected. Reputation mattered as much inside homes as in public forums. Through structured markets, regulated trade, and disciplined merchants, Rome ensured the economy operated predictably. Efficiency, fairness, and oversight were priorities. Citizens could navigate commerce with confidence, relying on rules as much as trust. Commerce, like clothing, bathing, and sleep, reinforced order. Every transaction contributed to a system that allowed millions of people to live, work, and thrive in one sprawling, crowded, and complex city. And as day gave way to evening, as merchants closed, stalls and wagons returned to depots, the city shifted focus once more from work and trade to safety, leisure, and observation. The empire's order was maintained in every activity, large and small. In Rome, law was the backbone of daily life. Every activity, from walking through the streets to trading goods to private conduct, was regulated to ensure the empire functioned smoothly. But law in Rome was not just about rules on paper. It was a system deeply integrated into social expectation, morality, and practical governance. Enforcement combined formal authority, social pressure, and tradition to maintain order. The Roman legal system distinguished between citizens and non-citizens, free people and slaves. Laws were applied differently depending on status, wealth, and gender. Citizens enjoyed protections, while slaves and foreigners had limited rights. Yet all were subject to rules intended to preserve public order. In this way, law reinforced hierarchy and maintained stability across a complex, multi-ethnic city. Punishment in Rome was highly visible and deliberately structured. Minor infractions were dealt with quietly through fines or social reprimand. A citizen who violated marketplace rules, arrived late to civic duties, or failed household rituals could be fined or shamed. The goal was not always retribution. It was correction and reinforcement of expected behavior. Public perception mattered as much as the law itself. Severe crimes, murder, arson, theft, or treason invited harsher punishment. Flogging, exile, confiscation of property, and in extreme cases, execution, were used to deter others. Punishments were often public to maximize their effect. A citizen witnessing justice being served understood both the consequences of wrongdoing and the state's capacity to enforce order. Courts operated according to strict rules. Legal procedures were formal and predictable. Testimonies, evidence, and arguments were organized according to time-tested protocols. Magistrates and judges guided proceedings to ensure fairness for citizens while reinforcing hierarchy. A consistent legal process allowed confidence in the system, even when the outcome was harsh. Slaves, as property, were treated differently under the law. Their bodies, labor, and behavior were regulated by owners, but not without limits. Excessive cruelty that threatened social stability could prompt state intervention. Slaves who committed offenses faced immediate punishment, often without a formal trial. Their status made them vulnerable, Yet the overall system depended on predictable treatment to prevent rebellion. Social control extended beyond courts and official punishments. Citizens learned acceptable behavior through gossip, observation, and reputation. Public opinion reinforced legal norms. A man who violated social expectations arriving late, speaking disrespectfully, or flaunting excessive wealth risked ostracism. In this way, informal mechanisms worked alongside formal law to guide behavior continuously. Certain professions and groups were heavily monitored. Merchants, public officials, gladiators, and entertainers all operated under scrutiny. Rules governed their interactions, transactions, and performance. Failure to comply could disrupt public order. By ensuring that each group followed predictable patterns, Rome maintained cohesion across a densely populated city. Religious oversight intersected with legal control. Temples and priests monitored ritual observance, marking neglect as both moral and civic failure. Violating sacred norms could result in legal consequences, emphasizing that social control in Rome operated through multiple, overlapping layers. Law, custom, religion, and expectation. Curfews and nighttime regulations were another form of legal enforcement. Citizens were expected to remain home after dark unless conducting legitimate business. Unauthorized movement could prompt intervention by night watchmen. This reinforced discipline, minimized risk, and preserved public order while integrating citizens' private routines into the framework of governance. Public spaces were regulated carefully. Streets, forums, and markets were maintained to ensure safety and accessibility. Guards, magistrates, and civic authorities monitored behavior to prevent disorder. Individuals could be fined, removed, or arrested for disturbing peace. Even seemingly minor acts, shouting, obstructing passage, or displaying offensive sins were subject to enforcement. Rome emphasized predictability over freedom to maintain the city's complex ecosystem. Punishments were not random. They were proportional and intentional. Magistrates aimed to balance deterrence, fairness, and reinforcement of social norms. A minor theft might result in restitution or flogging. Repeated offenses escalated consequences. This tiered system created a clear framework for citizens to understand limits and consequences. Public executions and corporal punishment served another purpose: spectacle and education. While harsh by modern standards, these acts reminded citizens that laws were real, observable, and consequential. They reinforced authority and demonstrated the consequences of deviation. Observation of punishment became a tool for social control, ensuring compliance through both fear and understanding. Education also reinforced law and social norms. Children learned the rules of behavior early: how to dress, where to sit, how to speak, and how to interact. Schools and families instilled obedience, civility, and respect for authority. This early indoctrination minimized the need for intervention later in life. Knowledge of legal and social boundaries became internalized. Even entertainment was subject to legal oversight. Theater, festivals, and games were permitted but regulated. Excessive rowdiness, public insult, or disruption of civic events could result in fines or removal. The purpose was to allow enjoyment while maintaining order. Fun existed within boundaries, not outside them. Rome's reliance on law extended to economic life as well. Trade, contracts, and property ownership were regulated to prevent disputes and encourage stability. Markets, workshops, and households operated under predictable rules. Citizens knew that compliance ensured survival and prosperity, while violations invited penalties. Ultimately, law in Rome was a framework for coordination. It guided behavior in public and private spheres, defined social hierarchy, reinforced morality, and ensured the smooth functioning of daily life. Punishment was one tool among many, integrated with custom, religion, and social expectation. Together, these elements maintained the cohesion of an empire that spanned continents and populations. Law and enforcement were not perfect, but they were effective. Rome did not rely on fear alone. It relied on the internalization of rules, the observation of peers, and the understanding that every action had consequences. This system allowed a city of millions to function with remarkable order, even amidst density, diversity, and complexity. As night fell and citizens retired to their homes, aware of their duties and the consequences of disobedience, Rome's legal and social framework remained active, guiding, observing, and shaping the lives of all who called the city home. The next chapter, Chapter 15, Education, Knowledge, and Social Discipline, will explore how Rome trained its citizens to internalize these laws and expectations, ensuring that the empire could continue functioning seamlessly across generations. Education began at home. The paterfamilias oversaw early instruction, teaching basic literacy, numeracy, and moral conduct. Children learned to read and write Latin, the language of law, administration, and culture, ensuring that they could participate in civic life. Greek was often taught to the elite as well, enabling access to philosophy, rhetoric, and science. Citizens absorbed knowledge of law, ritual, and hierarchy by performing them repeatedly. These experiences became internalized rules that guided action long after formal schooling ended. Even literacy served social control. Reading and writing were not purely skills. They conveyed responsibility. Citizens who could read legal documents, contracts, or public notices were expected to understand and comply. Knowledge became a form of civic accountability. The educated were responsible for maintaining social norms. Ignorance could be tolerated, but knowledge imposed duty. Observation played a key role in education. Children and apprentices were taught to notice social cues, anticipate expectations, and adjust behavior accordingly. Walking through streets, participating in markets, or attending ceremonies became practical exercises in awareness and social intelligence was part of education, reinforcing the invisible rules that governed Rome. Discipline extended into leisure and personal behavior. Entertainment, dining, and social interaction were all opportunities for applying lessons from school. Citizens learned timing, manners, and moderation. Excessive indulgence was discouraged. Every action was an exercise in self-control and civic responsibility. Knowledge allowed slaves to function effectively, but it never equated to freedom. Discipline remained the central goal. Rome understood that internalized knowledge and discipline reduced the need for constant oversight. They followed law, participated in ritual, and respected authority naturally. Education created order, not by force alone, but by shaping thought and behavior from the earliest years. Ultimately, the empire relied on education to sustain itself. It was a comprehensive system that combined intellectual instruction, moral guidance, physical training, and practical experience. Through these layers, Rome ensured that every citizen knew their place, understood their duties, and respected the structures that held society together. Knowledge and discipline were inseparable, reinforcing the empire from the inside out. By the end of adolescence, most citizens were fully integrated into Rome's social machinery. They understood not only what was legal or illegal, but what was expected in daily life, what behaviors promoted order, and how to navigate the city's complex systems of hierarchy, commerce, and ritual. Education produced adults capable of maintaining continuity, stability, and obedience in one of history's largest and most sophisticated civilizations. Rome endured for centuries, and much of that endurance was invisible. It was not solely the legions, the senators, or the monumental architecture that preserved the empire. Was the intricate web of rules governing everyday life. From bathing to sleep, from trade to entertainment, from family life to public speech, Romans lived under a system that balanced freedom with regulation, personal habits with social expectation, and private desire with civic duty. These rules were not arbitrary. They were the foundation of stability that allowed a sprawling, crowded, and diverse city on. Later in Empire to function. The greatest achievement of Roman regulation was predictability. Citizens understood what to expect from streets, markets, public events, and households. Traffic patterns, noise limits, curfews, and sleep schedules all created a rhythm of life that minimized conflict and chaos. When millions of people shared space in densely packed cities, predictability was essential. By internalizing these rules from childhood through education, religious practice, and observation, Romans acted in ways that reinforced order without constant oversight. Hierarchy and social distinction were central to this system. Laws and customs defined roles: who could speak, who could move freely, who could marry, and who could participate in trade or ritual. Slaves, freedmen, citizens, men, women, children, all had defined expectations. By clearly outlining boundaries, Rome prevented confusion, friction, and instability. Even what might seem mundane, where a vendor set up, how a cart moved, how loudly someone spoke, was part of this invisible architecture of control. Religion reinforced compliance. Daily household rituals, temple ceremonies, and festival participation reminded citizens that their actions were observed not only by society but by the divine. Obedience was moral as well as civic. Missing a prayer, neglecting a rite, or failing to honor sacred norms carried both social and spiritual consequences. Religion, law, and social expectation worked together to maintain cohesion. Education ensured continuity. From early childhood, Romans were trained to follow rules, anticipate consequences, and respect hierarchy. Schools, apprenticeships, and household instruction produced citizens who internalized the empire's values and understood their role within it. Knowledge itself became a mechanism of control. To understand the laws and customs was to participate correctly in society, while ignorance risked exclusion or failure. Commerce thrived because of regulation. Markets operated predictably. Trade followed clear protocols, and goods were monitored for fairness and quality. Rules governed timing, pricing, and behavior, ensuring that the economy could sustain a massive population. Even entertainment, often thought of as leisure, served as a controlled space for social reinforcement. Gladiatorial games, theater, festivals, and public celebrations combined enjoyment with hierarchy, timing, and behavioral expectation. Citizens participated, observed, and learned the limits of acceptable behavior. The control of noise, traffic, and public movement was equally important. Rome's streets, often chaotic to outsiders, were governed by tacit rules that citizens understood intuitively. Nighttime curfews, designated cart routes, and pedestrian pathways reduced accidents and disorder. Even sleep and rest were regulated, shaping household routines and public safety. Obedience was instilled in every corner of daily life, creating a city that functioned predictably despite its size and density. Family life and sexual behavior were regulated to sustain the empire itself. Marriage, inheritance, and the legitimacy of children were state concerns. Laws encouraged citizen marriage, monitored adultery, and rewarded families that contributed to the population and social stability. Sexual behavior was guided by hierarchy, gender, and status, ensuring that the structure of households aligned with the empire's goals. By controlling private life, Rome strengthened the public order that depended on predictable households, inheritance, and citizen responsibility. Even punishment and law enforcement contributed to stability. Visible public punishments, fines, and court proceedings reinforced social norms, while informal mechanisms gossip reputation. Pure observation maintained compliance quietly. Citizens learned quickly that deviation carried consequences, and the empire leveraged both fear and social expectation to regulate millions effectively. The cumulative effect of these rules was subtle yet powerful. Rome did not need constant coercion to maintain order. Its citizens had internalized the structures of behavior, rhythm, and expectation. The result was a city and an empire that could function efficiently, adapt to crises, and absorb diverse peoples and cultures. Boundaries and discipline became invisible infrastructure, as essential to the empire as roads, aqueducts, and walls. The legacy of Roman regulation endured long after the empire's political and military collapse. Medieval cities, modern legal systems, urban planning, and civic rituals all carry echoes of Roman thought. The understanding that order, predictability, and structured behavior are necessary for society to function. Rome's genius was not only in conquest or construction, it was in designing a civilization where daily life itself reinforced stability, hierarchy, and continuity. Every bathhouse rule, every market regulation, every expectation of silence, obedience, and ritual contributed to an invisible architecture of control. Romans followed routines not only to survive, but to live in a city that demanded participation, conformity, and awareness. It was this careful balance between freedom and regulation, individuality and hierarchy, private desire and public duty that allowed one of history's largest empires to endure for centuries. And so, when we reflect on Roman daily life, we see more than strange customs, rules, or rituals. We see a civilization built on discipline, observation, an expectation society in which the ordinary behaviors of millions, from waking to sleeping, from trade to leisure, were all woven into a framework that preserved order. The empire's power lay not just in armies or politics, but in the invisible yet meticulous control of life itself. Rome survived because its people knew how to act, when to act, and how to obey, often without thinking. That was the true genius of the empire. the subtle mastery of the everyday. And with this, the story of Rome's peculiar daily rules, the invisible architecture of life, and the foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations comes to a close. And there you have a glimpse into the strange, fascinating, and surprisingly practical rules that guided every aspect of daily life in ancient Rome. From sleep and leisure to trade, law, and social behavior, these customs weren't just quirks. They were the invisible infrastructure that kept an empire of millions functioning smoothly for centuries. If you enjoyed this journey into Roman life, don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who loves history as much as you do. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from our channel. Which Roman rule surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story from the past.